the room of preserved light. There was, Miss Marple often reflected, something rather unsettling about beauty that had been preserved too carefully. It was not that she disliked such things, on the contrary she appreciated them very much, but there was always, beneath the admiration, a faint suggestion of something held too tightly, something that had resisted the natural course of time. And anything that resisted time, she had found, often carried a story it did not wish to tell. It was with this quiet thought that she first heard of the Amber Room exhibition, arriving in St. Mary Mead. The news had spread quickly, as such things always did. It was not every day that something described as rare and remarkable made its way into their modest village. There had been talk of craftsmanship, of historical significance, of a room once lost and now recreated with astonishing precision. Mrs. Price Ridley had been particularly animated about it, declaring it a cultural event of the highest order, though Miss Marple suspected her interest lay just as much in the visitors it would attract. People of refinement, Mrs. Price Ridley had said with a certain emphasis, as though refinement were something one might acquire simply by proximity. Miss Marple had smiled politely. Yes, she had said, that is often the case. The exhibition itself had been set up in a temporary structure near the edge of the village, a curious arrangement of panels and carefully controlled lighting designed to replicate, as faithfully as possible, the original Amber Room. Miss Marple had gone, of course, not out of excitement exactly, but out of interest. For such things she knew, or often brought more than they appeared to. The moment she stepped inside, she paused. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The walls glowed, not brightly, but warmly, with a deep, honeyed light that seemed almost alive. The amber panels, intricately carved and polished, reflected the soft illumination in a way that was both gentle and mesmerizing. It was, she thought, undeniably beautiful. And yet, she moved slowly along the perimeter, her gaze attentive. There was something about it. Not the craftsmanship, that was beyond question, but the feeling, the sense that what one was seeing was not entirely what it seemed. Yes, she murmured softly, a reconstruction. Not the original, not quite the same, and yet presented as though it were. She paused near one of the panels, her reflection faintly visible in its surface. Ah, preserved, she said quietly, or perhaps recreated. And there, she felt, lay the difference. For preservation suggested continuity, but reconstruction, that suggested something else entirely, something assembled, something chosen, something that might omit as much as it included. Miss Marple turned slightly as voices approached. A small group had gathered near the centre of the room, their conversation carrying a tone of polite admiration. Among them stood Mr. Alistair Denham, a man whose presence had been noted in the village since his arrival 2 days prior. He was, by all accounts, a man of considerable means and equally considerable taste. His interest in the exhibition had been instrumental in bringing it to St. Mary Mead, and he had made no effort to conceal his satisfaction at its success. Remarkable, he was saying. Quite remarkable. To think that something so exquisite can be brought back, restored, as it were, to its former glory. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, though she did not interrupt. There was something in his tone, not pride exactly, but a certain ownership that caught her attention, as though the restoration were not merely an achievement, but a correction, a setting right of something that had once gone wrong. Yes, she murmured, that is often how it is seen. Mr. Denham turned slightly, acknowledging her presence with a courteous nod. Miss Marple, is it not? He said. I have heard your name. Indeed, Miss Marple replied gently. I hope not in any troubling context. He smiled faintly. On the contrary, I understand you have a keen eye for detail. Miss Marple returned the smile. One does what one can. There was a brief pause, then Mr. Denham said, What do you think of it? Miss Marple looked around the room once more, her gaze lingering on the amber panels. It is very beautiful, she said. Yes, he agreed. But? Miss Marple's eyes returned to him. But beauty, when carefully arranged, can sometimes conceal as much as it reveals. There was the slightest shift in his expression. Not discomfort exactly, but something close to it. An interesting observation, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Only a general one. The conversation moved on, as such things did, but Miss Marple remained thoughtful. Mr. Denham had not dismissed her remark, nor had he fully accepted it. He had simply acknowledged it and moved past it, as though it touched upon something he preferred not to examine too closely. "Yes," she murmured softly, "that is often significant." She continued her quiet observation as the afternoon wore on. Visitors came and went, their reactions varying from admiration to quiet curiosity. Some lingered, drawn by the glow of the amber. Others passed through more quickly, as though sensing something they could not quite name, and among them, Miss Marple noticed small things, glances exchanged, conversations that paused when others approached, a certain carefulness in the way some individuals moved within the room, as though they were not merely observing, but remembering. "Yes," she said quietly, "that is most interesting." For it suggested that the room, this reconstruction, this carefully assembled beauty, was not entirely new to everyone present. Not in the deeper sense, not in the way that mattered. The afternoon light began to fade, and with it the exhibition prepared to close for the day. Miss Marple made her way toward the exit, her thoughts settling into a quiet pattern. "Yes," she murmured, "there is more here than appears." She had nearly reached the door when a sudden disturbance broke the calm. A voice, sharp, startled, cut through the quiet murmur of conversation. "Mr. Denham?" There was a movement, a shift in the gathered visitors, and then a second voice, lower, urgent. Miss Marple turned, her gaze steady. Mr. Denham stood near the centre of the room, his posture altered, his expression no longer composed. For a moment, he seemed merely unwell, his hand resting against one of the amber panels, his face pale. Then he collapsed. The room, which had moments before been filled with quiet admiration, and now held something entirely different. Confusion, concern, a rising sense of unease. Someone moved forward, another called for assistance, but Miss Marple did not move immediately. She stood where she was, her gaze fixed on the place where he had fallen. "Yes," she said softly, "not quite what it seems." For there was something about the moment, the setting, the precise nature of it, that did not align with the simplicity of illness. The amber room glowed quietly around them, its preserved light unchanged. But within that glow, something had shifted, and Miss Marple, who had seen such shifts before, knew, with quiet certainty, that what had just occurred was no accident at all. A death in perfect light. The first reaction, as Miss Marple had expected, was confusion rather than alarm. People did not immediately assume the worst, or especially in a place so carefully arranged for admiration rather than distress. Mr. Denham's collapse, though sudden, was at first treated as an unfortunate incident, perhaps the result of fatigue, or the strain of travel, or even the warmth within the enclosed space of the amber room. "He must have felt faint," someone said. "It is rather warm in here," another added, though the temperature had been carefully regulated. Miss Marple said nothing. She remained where she was for a moment longer, observing not the man himself but those around him. For it was often, she had found, in such moments, that people revealed themselves, not through what they said, but through what they did not. A gentleman bent beside Mr. Denham, attempting to rouse him, while a woman nearby pressed her hand to her mouth in visible distress. Another visitor had already moved toward the entrance, calling for assistance. Everything appeared quite proper, quite expected. And yet, Miss Marple's gaze shifted. There, near the far panel, stood a man who did not move at all. His expression was composed, too composed perhaps, and his attention fixed not on Mr. Denham but on the amber itself, as though the event unfolding behind him were of secondary importance. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured softly, "that is curious." She moved forward at last, her steps unhurried, her manner entirely calm. By the time she reached the centre of the room, Mr. Denham had been laid gently upon the floor. His face was pale, very pale, and his breathing, if present at all, was not visible. The gentleman attending him looked up as Miss Marple approached. "Do you know if he had any condition?" he asked, though it was not clear to whom the question was directed. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "I do not believe so," she said. A woman knelt nearby, her voice trembling. "He was perfectly well only a moment ago," she said. "He was speaking, quite normally." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "quite normally." She did not kneel, nor did she attempt to intervene. Others were already doing what could be done, and she had long since learned that her role in such situations was not to act, but to observe. The air within the room seemed to have changed. The warm glow of the amber, which had moments before felt inviting, now carried something else, a stillness that was no longer peaceful, but suspended, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Yes, she said quietly. A different sort of preservation. Footsteps approached from the entrance, brisk and purposeful. Dr. Haydock, who had been summoned with commendable speed, entered the room and moved at once to Mr. Denham's side. The gathered visitors stepped back, allowing him space. There was a brief examination, swift, efficient, and conducted with the calm professionalism of a man accustomed to such moments. Then Dr. Haydock sat back slightly, his expression grave. "I am afraid," he said, "that Mr. Denham is no longer with us." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. A murmur passed through those present, shock, disbelief, and something else, less easily defined. "But it cannot be," someone said. "He was speaking only moments ago." Dr. Haydock did not respond to that. Instead, he said, "I shall need to make further inquiries, of course, but at present there is no immediate indication of anything unusual." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "No," she murmured, "not immediate." Her gaze drifted once more to the amber panels. They remained unchanged, their warm light undisturbed, their surfaces reflecting the figures within the room with quiet clarity. "Yes," she said softly, "that is the difficulty." For everything appeared exactly as it should. The room was intact, the arrangement undisturbed. The event, if viewed simply, was one of sudden illness, and yet... Miss Marple's attention returned to the individuals around her. The woman who had knelt beside Mr. Denham was now seated, her composure slowly returning. The gentleman who had first attended him stood quietly to one side, his expression thoughtful, and the man near the far panel, he had not moved, not until now. As the announcement of death was made, he turned slightly, not toward Mr. Denham but toward the exit, as though the conclusion of the matter had released him from the need to remain. Miss Marple's eyes followed him briefly. "Yes," she murmured, "that is most interesting." She did not attempt to stop him. That was not her way. But she noted the detail carefully, placing it within the quiet structure of her thoughts. Dr. Haydock rose, his attention now shifting to those present. "I must ask that no one leave immediately," he said. "There are certain formalities that must be observed." There was a general assent, though not without some visible unease. Miss Marple moved slightly toward the edge of the room, her gaze still attentive. The initial shock had begun to settle, and in its place something more measured was emerging. People spoke in lower tones now, their words more careful, their expressions more controlled. "Yes," she said softly, "that is always the way." For once the immediate moment passed, the mind began to adjust, to seek explanation, to restore order, and in that process certain details were emphasized, while others were quietly set aside. Miss Marple had seen it many times before. She stood for a moment longer, then moved slowly toward the panel where Mr. Denham had been standing before he fell. Her gaze rested on its surface, the amber glowing softly beneath her reflection. "Yes," she murmured, "he was here." Not merely within the room, but at this precise point. His hand had rested against the panel, that much had been clear, and his collapse had followed almost immediately. Miss Marple did not touch the surface. She did not need to. Instead, she stepped back slightly, her thoughts settling into a clearer form. "Yes," she said, "that is not without significance. For while the death might appear natural, while the setting might suggest nothing more than unfortunate coincidence, the timing, the position, and the subtle details surrounding the moment told a different story. Not openly, not yet, but enough. Enough to suggest that what had occurred within that room of preserved light had not been as simple as it seemed. Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze once more taking in the assembled visitors. "Yes," she murmured, "a death in perfect light." And it was precisely that perfection, that careful arrangement, that absence of visible disturbance, that made it all the more unlikely to be accidental. For in her experience, true accidents rarely occurred so neatly, so completely, and never, she thought quietly, in a room designed to conceal as much as it revealed. Reflections beneath the surface. Miss Marple did not leave with the others when, at last, they were permitted to depart. She moved slowly, allowing the small cluster of visitors to pass ahead of her, each one carrying away their own version of what had occurred. It was already beginning, she noticed, the quiet reshaping of the event. "So sudden," one woman said. "These things do happen," another replied. A gentleman spoke in low, confident tones about the unpredictability of the human heart, as though such explanations might restore a sense of order. Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so. "Yes," she murmured softly, "that is how it begins." For once a simple explanation presented itself. People were often quick to accept it, not because it was correct, but because it was comfortable. Sudden illness required no further inquiry. It disturbed nothing beyond the immediate moment. But Miss Marple, who had observed far too many such moments, did not find comfort in simplicity when it appeared too complete. She stepped outside into the fading afternoon, the air cool and ordinary in contrast to the enclosed glow of the amber room. For a brief moment she paused, her gaze resting on the structure that housed the exhibition. From the outside it appeared entirely unremarkable, temporary, practical, without any suggestion of what lay within. "Yes," she said quietly. "Appearances." She began to walk, her pace unhurried, her thoughts moving steadily beneath the surface of her calm expression. Mr. Denham's death had occurred at a precise moment. He had been speaking, composed, assured, and then, without warning, he had fallen. There had been no visible sign of distress beforehand, no gradual weakening, no hesitation, and that, Miss Marple reflected, was not entirely consistent with natural causes. "Yes," she murmured, "too sudden." But it was not the suddenness alone that concerned her. It was the setting, the amber room, a place designed with care, arranged with intention, a place where every detail had been considered, controlled and preserved. "Yes," she said, "nothing accidental about it." She reached her home and seated herself by the window, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. It was not the sort of problem that required haste. Rather, it required patience and attention to the smallest of details. Her thoughts returned to the room itself, the amber panels, the controlled lighting, the stillness, and within that stillness, the people. "Yes," she murmured softly, "it is always the people." She began to consider them, one by one. The woman who had shown distress, her reaction had been immediate, genuine, though not deeply personal. Concern, rather than grief. The gentleman who had assisted, efficient, composed, perhaps accustomed to such situations. And then, Miss Marple's needles paused. "The man by the panel," she said quietly. His stillness had been the most striking detail. Not the absence of reaction exactly, but the nature of it. He had not been indifferent. He had been detached, as though his attention lay elsewhere, not on the event but on something connected to it, something within the room itself. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her movements slow and deliberate. "Yes," she said, "that is not without meaning." She considered his departure. It had not been hurried, nor had it been delayed. It had occurred at the precise moment when the outcome was confirmed, when Mr. Denham's death had been acknowledged, as though his presence had been required only up to that point. "Yes," she murmured, "quite precise." Her thoughts shifted then, returning to Mr. Denham himself. A man of means, of influence, a man who had brought the exhibition to St. Mary Mead, not merely as a patron, but as someone with a particular interest in it. "Restored," he had said, "brought back." There had been something in his tone, something beyond admiration, something closer to ownership, or perhaps correction. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. "Yes," she said softly, "that is important." For such language suggested not only appreciation but involvement, a personal connection to the idea of restoration, to the act of reconstructing something that had once been lost, and that she felt was not without significance. She set her knitting aside and rose slowly, her thoughts now taking on a clearer shape. "Yes," she murmured, "there is something beneath it. Not visible, not immediately apparent, but present, as it so often was." She moved to the small table near the window and poured herself a cup of tea, her movements steady, unhurried. It was not the sort of matter that revealed itself all at once. Rather, it required careful attention, an understanding of how small details connected to one another. The room, the man, the moment, and the others present. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her tea untouched. "Yes," she said, "reflections." For the amber panels had not only glowed, they had reflected. Every figure within the room had been mirrored, however faintly, in their surfaces, positions, movements, proximity. "Yes," she murmured, "that is quite important." She had not studied those reflections at the time, not consciously, but she'd seen enough to know that they would have revealed more than the eye alone might notice: who stood where, who moved, who remained still, and, perhaps most significantly, who had been closest to Mr. Denham at the moment before he fell. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her thoughts sharpened. "Yes," she said softly, "that is where one must look. Not at the obvious, not at the explanation that presented itself most readily, but at the subtle details, the ones that seemed incidental but were not." She resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm returning. "Yes," she murmured, beneath the surface. For that was where the truth lay, not in the preserved beauty of the room, nor in the immediate assumption of illness, but in the quiet interplay of people, memory, and intention. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing such things, knew, with quiet certainty, that what had happened within that glowing chamber had not been simple, had not been accidental, and had not, she thought softly, been entirely unexpected. The visitors and their stories. Miss Marple believed firmly that no event, however sudden, existed in isolation. People carried with them small histories, fragments of the past that shaped their actions in ways not immediately visible. And when something unusual occurred, it was rarely enough to examine the moment itself. One had to look at those who'd been present and at what they brought with them into that moment. She sat by her window the following morning, her knitting moving with quiet precision as she arranged her thoughts. "Yes," she murmured softly, "it is always a question of who was there." The amber room had not simply attracted interest. It had drawn a particular sort of visitor. Not the usual steady pattern of village attendants, but something more varied, more deliberate. People had come not only to admire, but to see, and perhaps to be seen. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose slowly. There was no need to speculate from a distance when observation, properly conducted, could reveal far more. By mid-morning, she had made her way once again toward the exhibition grounds, though this time she did not enter immediately. Instead, she lingered near the entrance where a small group had gathered, their conversation subdued but unmistakably focused on the previous day's events. "Such a shock," one woman was saying, "to collapse like that." "Quite extraordinary," another replied, "though I suppose one never knows." Miss Marple inclined her head politely as she passed, her attention not on their words but on their tone. Already the narrative was settling into something familiar. Sudden illness, unfortunate, but not suspicious. "Yes," she murmured, "that is the easier way." Inside the exhibition, the atmosphere had changed. The warm glow of the amber remained, but the sense of quiet admiration had been replaced by something more restrained. Visitors moved more slowly now, their voices lowered, their attention divided between the beauty of the room and the memory of what had occurred within it. Miss Marple did not walk immediately toward the centre. Instead, she moved along the edges, her gaze attentive, her manner entirely unremarkable. It was not the room she was observing now. It was the people within it. The woman who had shown distress the previous day was present once more. She stood near one of the panels, her expression composed, though there remained a faint trace of unease in her manner. Miss Marple approached her gently. "It was quite a shock yesterday," she said. The woman turned, her expression softening slightly. "Yes," she replied. "I have never seen anything like it." "You knew Mr. Denham?" Miss Marple asked. The woman hesitated. "Not well," she said. "We had met. Socially." Miss Marple inclined her head. "He seemed a man of strong interests," she said. "Yes," the woman replied. "Very particular about certain things." "Indeed?" Miss Marple said gently. "Yes," the woman continued. "Especially about this exhibition. He spoke of it as though it meant more than it should." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "More than it should?" As though it were not simply an exhibition, the woman said, but something personal. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, she murmured. That is most interesting. She moved on after a few moments, her thoughts settling into place. Mr. Denham's interest in the amber room had not been merely aesthetic. It had been something more, something connected to himself, to his past perhaps, or to something he believed had been lost and restored. Yes, she said softly. A personal connection. She turned her attention next to the gentleman who had assisted Mr. Denham. He stood near the far side of the room, his posture relaxed, his expression thoughtful. Miss Marple approached him with quiet ease. "You were very helpful yesterday," she said. He inclined his head. "One does what one can," he replied. "Quite," Miss Marple said. "You noticed nothing unusual before Mr. Denham collapsed?" The gentleman considered. "No," he said. "He appeared entirely well. No sign of distress?" "None," he replied. "It was most sudden." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. "Quite sudden." She studied him for a moment longer, then moved on. His account was straightforward. Too straightforward, perhaps, but not inconsistent. "Yes," she murmured. "He saw nothing. Or perhaps nothing that he recognized." At last, her attention returned to the man who had stood by the panel, the one who had not reacted as the others had. He was present again, standing in almost the same position as before. His gaze rested on the amber, his expression composed, his manner entirely self-contained. Miss Marple approached him quietly. "It is remarkable, is it not?" she said. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes," he replied. "Remarkable?" His voice was calm, measured. "You were here yesterday," Miss Marple said. It was not a question. "Yes." "You did not seem surprised." There was the faintest pause. "Death is always a possibility," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "but not always an expectation." The man regarded her for a moment. "You believe it was something else?" he asked. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "I believe," she said, "that it occurred in a very particular place at a very particular moment." He did not respond immediately. Then he said, "Places do not act, Miss Marple. People do." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "but places can be chosen." There was a silence between them, brief, but not empty. Then the man inclined his head slightly. "That is true," he said. Miss Marple did not press further. She had no need to. The exchange had revealed enough. She moved away, her thoughts now more defined than before. "Yes," she murmured softly, "they're not here by chance." Each of them carried something, some connection, however subtle, to the room, to the exhibition, or perhaps to Mr. Denham himself, not openly, not obviously, but present. She paused near the centre of the room, her gaze taking in the amber panels once more. "Yes," she said, "the visitors and their stories." For that was where the truth lay, not in the surface of the room, nor in the immediate explanation of events, but in the quiet interplay of people, their histories, and the choices they made. And Miss Marple, who had seen such patterns before, knew, with quiet certainty, that the amber room had not simply gathered an audience. It had gathered those who belonged to it, in ways they had not yet spoken, but would. What was restored, and what was not. Miss Marple returned home with her thoughts more clearly arranged than before, though she did not yet consider them complete. There were still spaces, quiet gaps where understanding had not fully settled. But she had learned long ago that such gaps were not obstacles, they were invitations. Invitations to look more closely, to listen more carefully, and above all, to consider what might have been left unsaid. She seated herself by the window, her knitting once again in her hands, though her attention remained elsewhere. "Yes," she murmured softly, "restoration." It was a word that had been used more than once in connection with the amber room. Mr. Denham himself had spoken of it with particular emphasis, as though it held some meaning beyond its ordinary sense. Restored to its former glory, he had said. But Miss Marple, who had observed the room with some care, knew that such a phrase was not entirely accurate. The amber room before them was not the original. It could not be. It was instead a reconstruction, a careful and deliberate recreation of something that had once existed, and that, she felt, made all the difference. Yes, she said quietly. A selection. For in reconstructing anything, choices must be made. What to include, what to omit, what to emphasize, and those choices, however subtle, reflected not only the object itself, but the intentions of those who created it. She set her knitting aside and rose, moving slowly toward the small writing desk near the window. There were pamphlets there, materials distributed at the exhibition, describing its history, its craftsmanship, and the effort that had gone into its assembly. Miss Marple picked one up and read it carefully, her gaze moving over the printed words with quiet attention. The language was precise, respectful, informative. It spoke of history, of loss, of reconstruction. But it did not speak of everything. No, she murmured, not quite everything. There were references to origin, to craftsmanship, to the remarkable effort required to recreate such a space. But there was a certain absence, a lack of detail where one might expect it, particularly regarding the circumstances under which the original had been lost. Yes, she said, that is interesting. For omission, she knew, was often as significant as inclusion, and when something was left out, deliberately or otherwise, it suggested that it did not fit comfortably within the narrative being presented. She returned to her chair, her thoughts settling into a clearer form. Mr. Denham, she said softly. His interest in the exhibition had not been casual. That much was now beyond doubt. He had spoken of it with a sense of personal investment, as though it represented something more than an object of beauty, something that had been lost, and now, in some sense, reclaimed. But reclaimed from what? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. Yes, she murmured, that is the question. For restoration, when applied too firmly, could become something else. Not a return, but a correction, an attempt to reshape the past into something more acceptable, more complete, more controlled. And such attempts, she had found, rarely occurred without reason. Her thoughts returned to the visitors. Each of them, in their own way, had responded to the room differently. The woman, uneasy but composed. The gentleman, observant but detached. And the man by the panel, still, controlled, and entirely without visible reaction to the death itself. Yes, she said quietly, he is the most interesting. For he had not responded as the others had. He had not expressed surprise, nor concern, nor even curiosity. His attention had remained fixed, not on Mr. Denham, but on the room itself, as though the event, however significant, was secondary to something else, something he already understood. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her thoughts sharpened. Yes, she murmured, he knew something. Not necessarily about the death, but about the room, about its meaning, its history, or perhaps its connection to Mr. Denham. She rose once more, her decision forming quietly. There was still something she had not examined closely enough, not the people, nor the general atmosphere, but the room itself. Not as a whole, but in its details. By early afternoon she had returned to the exhibition. This time, however, she did not allow her attention to be drawn by the overall effect. Instead, she moved slowly from panel to panel, her gaze attentive, her manner entirely unobtrusive. Yes, she murmured softly, the details. At first there appeared to be nothing unusual. The craftsmanship was consistent, the patterns intricate, the surfaces polished to a soft glow. But as she continued, she began to notice small variations, subtle differences in tone, in texture, in the way the light was reflected. Yes, she said, not entirely uniform. That, in itself, was not surprising. A reconstruction, no matter how carefully executed, could not achieve perfect consistency. But the variations were not random. They appeared in certain places, particular panels, arranged in a pattern that was not immediately obvious, but not entirely accidental either. Miss Marple paused before one such panel, the very one near which Mr. Denham had been standing when he collapsed. Her gaze rested on its surface, her expression thoughtful. Yes, she murmured, this one. There was nothing visibly different about it, no flaw, no mark, and yet... She leaned slightly closer, her attention focused. Yes, she said softly, the finish. It was ever so slightly different. Not enough to be noticed casually, but enough to suggest that this panel had been treated in a manner distinct from the others. "Interesting," she murmured. She did not touch it. She did not draw attention to it. Instead, she stepped back, her thoughts now moving with quiet certainty. "Yes," she said, "what was restored, and what was not." For the room, as presented, was not simply a faithful recreation. It was something else, something shaped, something altered, however subtly, to serve a purpose beyond mere display. And Mr. Denham, with his particular interest, his careful language, and his precise position at the moment of his death, had been connected to that purpose in a way that was not yet fully understood. Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze once more taking in the room and those within it. "Yes," she murmured, "there is more here. Not in what had been shown, but in what had been chosen, and in those choices, she knew, lay the truth. The pattern, within the panels." Miss Marple did not hurry her conclusions. She had never trusted conclusions that arrived too quickly, particularly when they seemed to settle everything too neatly. Instead, she allowed her observations to arrange themselves gradually, like pieces of a pattern that only became visible when viewed from the proper distance. And it was, she reflected, very much a question of pattern. "Yes," she murmured softly as she resumed her seat within the amber room, "there is always a pattern." The visitors moved about her in quiet circulation, their presence no longer as animated as before, but still drawn by the gentle glow of the amber walls. Miss Marple, however, paid them little immediate attention. Her focus had shifted entirely to the panels themselves, not as individual objects, but as part of a greater whole. She allowed her gaze to travel slowly from one section of the room to another, noting the variations she had observed earlier. Slight differences in tone, in polish, in the way the light rested upon the surface. "Yes," she said quietly, "not random." That was the important point. For while inconsistency might be expected in any reconstruction, this was not inconsistency. It was arrangement, deliberate, subtle, and easily overlooked, but present nonetheless. Miss Marple rose and moved along the perimeter once more, this time with a clearer intention. She paused at each panel where the finish appeared slightly altered, marking its position in her mind. One near the entrance, another opposite it, a third closer to the centre, and then the one where Mr. Denham had stood. She stopped there, her gaze steady. "Yes," she murmured, "a sequence. Not obvious, not decorative, but structured. The altered panels formed a pattern, one that, when considered as a whole, suggested not randomness, but design. Yes," she said, "quite deliberate." She stepped back slightly, allowing herself a broader view. The panels taken together seemed to mark certain points within the room, positions that, if connected, would create a subtle arrangement, not geometric in the strictest sense, but purposeful. "Yes," she murmured, "a placement." And that, she felt, was the key. For if the panels had been altered intentionally, if their placement had been considered, then the room itself was not merely a reconstruction. It was a construction, designed not only to resemble something that had once existed, but to serve a function in the present. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her thoughts sharpened. "Yes," she said softly, "a function." She turned her attention briefly to the visitors once more. The woman she had spoken to earlier stood near the far side, her posture composed but her gaze distant. The gentleman who had assisted Mr. Denham was no longer present, and the man by the panel, he stood exactly where he had before, still, observing. Not the room in general, but one particular section of it. Miss Marple followed his gaze. It rested on one of the altered panels, the one opposite the place where Mr. Denham had collapsed. "Yes," she murmured, "he sees it. Not as others did, not as something beautiful, or even remarkable, but as something meaningful, something constructed, something understood." She approached him quietly, her manner as unassuming as ever. "You've been looking at that panel for some time," she said gently. He did not turn immediately. "It is worth looking at," he replied. "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "For its beauty." There was a pause, then he said, "For its precision." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "that is a better word." The man turned slightly then, his gaze meeting hers. "You have noticed it," he said. It was not a question. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One notices small things," she replied. "They are often the most revealing." He regarded her for a moment. "And what do you believe it reveals?" Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "That the room is not what it appears to be," she said. The man did not respond immediately. Then he said, "Few things are." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so." There was a brief silence between them, one not of discomfort, but of quiet acknowledgement. Then Miss Marple said, "Mr. Denham understood this, I think." The man's gaze returned to the panel. "Yes," he said. Miss Marple watched him carefully. "And you?" she asked. "Did you understand it as well?" The man's expression did not change. "I understood enough," he said. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Yes," she murmured. "Enough." That, she felt, was all he would say, and all he needed to. She did not press him further. Instead, she moved away once more, her thoughts now settling into a clearer form. "Yes," she said softly, "the pattern within the panels." It was no longer a question of possibility. It was a matter of design. The room had been constructed with intention, not only to replicate beauty, but to conceal something within that beauty. Not physically, perhaps, but structurally. A pattern, a placement, a sequence of positions that meant something to those who recognized it. And Mr. Denham, with his particular interest, his precise position, and the timing of his collapse, had recognized it. Miss Marple returned to the centre of the room, her gaze taking in the amber glow once more. "Yes," she murmured. He saw it, and in seeing it, he had placed himself at a specific point within that pattern, the panel, the position, the moment. "Yes," she said, "not accidental." For if the room had been arranged deliberately, and if Mr. Denham had moved within it with equal deliberation, then his death, occurring at that precise point, could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her thoughts were now firmly aligned. "Yes," she murmured, "it is nearly clear." The pattern had been constructed, the positions had been marked, and the individuals within the room, at least some of them, had understood what those positions meant. The amber room, with its preserved light and careful beauty, was not merely an exhibition. It was a structure, a design, and within that design, something had been set in motion. Something that had reached its conclusion at the exact moment when Mr. Denham stood where he did. And Miss Marple, who had followed the pattern to its edge, knew, with quiet certainty, that what remained was not to discover what had happened, but to understand why. The history that was not told. Miss Marple did not return home immediately. Instead, she chose a slower path, one that allowed her thoughts to settle without interruption. The pattern within the amber room had become clear enough to guide her, but patterns alone were not explanations. They pointed, they suggested, they revealed structure, but they did not in themselves explain purpose. And purpose, she knew, was always rooted in something deeper. "Yes," she murmured softly as she walked. "It is a question of history. Not the history that was printed in pamphlets or spoken in polite conversation, but the one that remained unspoken, the one that had been omitted, softened, or perhaps deliberately concealed. For the amber room, as it had been presented, was not complete. It was too carefully arranged, too precisely described, and too quietly selective in what it revealed. By the time Miss Marple reached her home, her course of action had already formed. There was in St. Mary Mead a person who might not have the entire history, but who would, at the very least, know where the gaps lay. And sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, knowing what was missing was just as valuable as knowing what was present. She sent a brief message, and before long Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, arrived. He was a man of measured speech and careful thought, and though not particularly inclined toward speculation, he possessed a quiet awareness of matters that others often overlooked. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into his chair, "you wish to speak with me?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "It concerns the Amber Room exhibition." Mr. Petherick inclined his head. "An unfortunate incident," he said. "Mr. Denham's death." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Unfortunate, but perhaps not entirely unexpected." The solicitor regarded her with mild interest. "You believe there is more to it?" Miss Marple folded her hands lightly in her lap. I believe, she said, that the exhibition itself may not be quite what it appears. Mr. Petherick considered this. In what sense? In the sense, Miss Marple replied, that it may represent not only a reconstruction, but a selection. There was a brief pause. Ah, he said slowly. You mean that certain aspects of its history may have been omitted? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. Quite so. Mr. Petherick leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. That would not be unusual, he said. Historical reconstructions often simplify matters for clarity. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but sometimes what is simplified is precisely what matters most. The solicitor regarded her for a moment longer. You're suggesting that there is something in the history of the Amber Room, or its reconstruction, that is relevant to Mr. Denham's death. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Mr. Petherick did not dismiss the idea. Instead, he said, There have been discussions. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Discussions? Yes, he continued, regarding the provenance of certain elements used in the reconstruction. Not widely publicised, of course. No, Miss Marple said. Of course not. There were questions, Mr. Petherick added, about whether all the materials used were properly accounted for, whether certain pieces may have been incorporated from sources not entirely documented. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, she murmured. That is most interesting. For such uncertainty suggested not merely omission, but substitution, not merely what had been left out, but what had been quietly included. And Mr. Denham? She asked. Mr. Petherick hesitated. He had a particular interest in such matters, he said. He was involved, to some extent, in the acquisition of certain materials. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her thoughts sharpened. Yes, she said, I had suspected as much. He was known, Mr. Petherick continued, for his attention to detail. Some might say, his insistence on accuracy. Accuracy, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes. There was a brief silence, then she said, and if he had reason to believe that the reconstruction was not entirely accurate. Mr. Petherick considered this carefully. He would not have ignored it, he said. He would have pursued it. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. I believe he did. Her thoughts returned to the moment within the Amber Room. Mr. Denham's position, his hand upon the panel, his sudden collapse. Yes, she said quietly. He'd found something. Not by chance, not by accident, but by intention. The pattern within the panels, the deliberate arrangement, had not gone unnoticed by him, and once noticed, he would have followed it. There is more, Mr. Petherick said. Miss Marple looked at him. Yes. The exhibition has drawn attention, he said, not only from those interested in art or history, but from individuals connected to certain past disputes. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, I have observed that. There were disagreements, Mr. Petherick continued, regarding ownership, authenticity, and the handling of certain items believed to be part of the original collection. Disagreements, Miss Marple repeated softly. Yes. And such disagreements, he added, are not always resolved as completely as one might wish. Miss Marple's gaze grew thoughtful. No, she said, they are not. There was a pause. Then she said, It seems, then, that the Amber Room is not merely a reconstruction, but a convergence. Mr. Petherick raised an eyebrow slightly. A convergence. Of histories, Miss Marple said, of claims, of grievances that may not have been settled. The solicitor considered this, then nodded slowly. Yes, he said, that would not be an unreasonable conclusion. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window, her thoughts now forming a clearer picture. Yes, she murmured softly, the history that was not told. It was not simply a matter of missing details. It was a matter of hidden connections, of people who had come to the exhibition not merely to observe, but because they were, in some way, part of its history, part of what it represented. And Mr. Denham, with his involvement, his insistence on accuracy, and his recognition of the pattern within the panels, had uncovered something that others present had also understood, something that had brought them all to that room, not by coincidence, but by design. Miss Marple turned back, her expression calm but certain. Yes, she said, it is becoming quite clear. The amber room had been constructed to preserve beauty, but in doing so it had also preserved something else, something unresolved, something contested, something that, once recognized, could not remain without consequence. And within that carefully arranged space, at that precise moment, the past had not simply been remembered, it had been confronted, and Miss Marple, who had followed the pattern from its surface to its source, knew, with quiet certainty, that what had happened to Mr. Denham was not the result of chance, but of history. The position that revealed everything. Miss Marple did not return to the amber room immediately after her conversation with Mr. Petherick. Instead, she allowed herself the quiet of her own sitting room, where the familiar rhythm of ordinary life made thinking easier. For it was not excitement that solved such matters, but calm reflection, the careful placing of one idea beside another until the shape of truth emerged of its own accord. "Yes," she murmured softly, her knitting resting untouched in her lap, "it is a question of position. Not merely where things were, but where they were meant to be. The pattern within the panels had not been decorative, it had not been accidental, it had been deliberate, and more than that, it had been functional. Mr. Denham had recognized it. Of that she was now quite certain. For he had not simply admired the room, he had moved within it with intention. He had placed himself at a particular point, at a particular moment, and then he had died. Miss Marple rose slowly and moved toward the window, her gaze resting on the quiet street beyond. "Yes," she said softly, "that is the key." For if the pattern marked positions, and if those positions held meaning, then Mr. Denham's presence at that precise panel could not have been incidental. It had been chosen. But by whom? Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured, "that is where it becomes interesting." For while Mr. Denham had recognized the pattern, he had not created it. The room itself had been arranged beforehand, the panels placed, the variations introduced, the structure established. "Yes," she said. Prepared. And if something had been prepared, then it had been prepared for a purpose. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her thoughts now moving with quiet clarity. "The panels mark positions," she said softly, "and positions suggest movement, not static observation, but direction, guidance, a sequence to be followed, and if one followed that sequence, one would arrive at a particular point, the point where Mr. Denham had stood." "Yes," she murmured, "quite precise." She considered this carefully. The pattern had been subtle enough to avoid casual notice, yet clear enough for someone attentive, someone knowledgeable, to recognize it. Mr. Denham, with his interest in the reconstruction and his insistence on accuracy, had seen it, and once seen. He would have followed it, not impulsively, not carelessly, but with purpose. "Yes," she said. He was led, not by force, not by instruction, but by design. The room itself had guided him, and that, Miss Marple reflected, was a very particular kind of intention. She rose again and made her way once more toward the exhibition. The afternoon light had begun to soften, casting a gentler tone over the village, but within the amber room the illumination remained unchanged, constant, controlled, and entirely artificial. As she entered, she did not pause as she had before. Instead, she moved directly to the panels she had already marked in her mind. One by one, she followed their sequence, not merely observing them, but tracing the path they suggested, from the entrance to the far wall, then across the room, and finally to the panel where Mr. Denham had stood. She stopped there, her gaze steady. "Yes," she murmured. "It leads here." There was no longer any doubt. The pattern formed a path, a deliberate progression from one point to another, and at its end. This position, this panel, this moment. Miss Marple turned slightly, her attention shifting to the space around her. "And if he followed it," she said softly, "he was not the only one who understood it." For such a design, once recognized, could not remain private. Others, particularly those connected to the room's history, would have seen it as well, and among those others was the man by the panel. Miss Marple glanced toward him. He stood not far away, his posture unchanged, his attention once again fixed on the room, not as a visitor, but as someone who understood its structure, Yes, she murmured. He knows. She approached him quietly, her manner as composed as ever. It is quite clever, she said gently. He did not turn at once. Yes, he replied. It is. A pattern, Miss Marple continued. A path. There was a slight pause. Then he said, You have followed it. Yes, she said. It leads here. The man inclined his head slightly. Yes, he said. Miss Marple regarded him carefully. And you knew that it would, she said. It was not a question. He did not deny it. Yes. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. And so did Mr. Denham. Yes. There was a brief silence. Then Miss Marple said very gently, He came here because of it. The man's gaze remained on the panel. Yes, he said. Miss Marple did not move, and when he reached this position, she allowed the sentence to remain incomplete. The man's voice was quiet. The design was complete, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, she murmured. That was the truth of it. Not merely that Mr. Denham had stood there, but that his presence at that point had completed something, a structure, a sequence, a design that required a final element. Yes, she said softly, the position that revealed everything. For in reaching that point, Mr. Denham had not only followed the pattern, he had fulfilled it, and in doing so, he had exposed whatever the pattern was meant to reveal. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. You were waiting, she said. The man did not respond immediately. Then he said, For the moment. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Yes, she said. The moment. The room around them remained quiet, its warm glow unchanged. But within that stillness, the truth had begun to take shape, not as something dramatic or sudden, but as something inevitable. The pattern had been set, the positions marked, the path followed, and at its conclusion, Mr. Denham had reached the point where everything came together. Miss Marple turned slowly, her thoughts now fully aligned. Yes, she murmured, it is no longer a question of how. For the how had become clear. The room had been designed, the path had been followed, the position had been reached. What remained was to understand why. And Miss Marple, who had traced the pattern to its end, knew, with quiet certainty, that the answer lay not in the room itself, but in what the room represented, and in what Mr. Denham, standing at that final point, had come to see, what he saw in the amber light. Miss Marple did not question the man further. There was no need. His quiet admissions had confirmed what she already understood. The pattern had been deliberate, the path intentional, and the final position, where Mr. Denham had stood, was no accident. But understanding the structure of an act was not the same as understanding its meaning, and meaning, she knew, was always personal. She left the amber room once more, the warm glow fading behind her as she stepped into the cool, ordinary air of the village. It was a relief, in a way, to be outside it. For the room, she reflected, held something more than light. It held intention. And intention, when concealed within beauty, was often the most dangerous kind. Yes, she murmured softly as she walked. It is a question of what he saw. Not with his eyes alone, but with his understanding. Mr. Denham had followed the pattern. He had reached the final position. And at that point, he had recognized something. Something that had not been visible before. Something that had completed the design in a way that could not be undone. Miss Marple returned home and seated herself by the window, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She did not take up her knitting. There was no need for distraction now. Her thoughts were clear, and they moved steadily toward their conclusion. The panels, she said softly, the variations. They had not been random. They had formed a sequence, a path leading to a particular point. But what had they been guiding the observer toward? Not merely a position, but a realization. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. Yes, she murmured, a revelation. For at that final position the room would not appear as it did from any other point. The reflections would align differently. The light would fall in a particular way. The altered panels, when viewed from that precise angle, would form something. Not a pattern alone, but an image. She rose slowly, her thoughts now sharpened by certainty. Yes, she said, that is it. The amber room, with its careful construction and subtle variations, had been designed to produce a specific effect, but only when seen from a specific place, a place marked by the pattern, a place that Mr. Denham had reached. He saw it, she murmured, and what he saw had changed everything. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind moved quickly now. An image, she said softly, or perhaps something concealed within the image. Not something obvious, not something that would be noticed by a casual observer, but something that would be unmistakable to one who understood its significance, something connected to the history of the room, to its reconstruction, to the materials that had been used and those that had not been properly accounted for. Yes, she said, something that should not have been there. Or perhaps something that had been there all along, but had been hidden within the design, revealed only when the pattern was followed, when the observer stood in exactly the right place. Miss Marple's gaze grew thoughtful, and he recognized it, she said, not merely as an anomaly, but as something meaningful, something connected to the past, to the disputes Mr. Petherick had mentioned, to the questions of ownership and authenticity, to the unresolved matters that had drawn certain individuals to the exhibition. Yes, she murmured. He understood, and in understanding, he had become dangerous, not in the sense of threat, but in the sense of knowledge, for knowledge once acquired could not be undone, and if that knowledge revealed something that others wished to keep concealed, then the one who possessed it could not be allowed to leave with it. Miss Marple sat down once more, her thoughts now settling into their final arrangement. Yes, she said softly, that is why. Mr. Denham had not been chosen at random. He had been expected. His interest in the exhibition, his attention to detail, his insistence on accuracy, all of it had made him the ideal observer, the one most likely to notice the pattern, to follow it, to reach the final position, and to see what lay there. Yes, she murmured. He was meant to see it, and the moment he did, the design had fulfilled its purpose. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, but there was a quiet gravity in her thoughts now. And someone else knew it would happen, she said. Someone who understood the pattern, who knew what it revealed, who knew that when Mr. Denham reached that position, he would see, and that, once he saw, action would be required. Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more toward the window, where the light had begun to fade into evening. Yes, she said softly, it was arranged. Not in haste, not in anger, but with deliberation, with patience, with a clear understanding of what would occur and when. The room had been constructed, the pattern set, the observer guided, and the moment prepared. Miss Marple's hands rested quietly in her lap. What he saw, she murmured, was the truth. Not the version presented in pamphlets, not the carefully arranged narrative of restoration and beauty, but the truth that lay beneath it, the one that had been concealed but not erased, and that truth, once revealed, had led directly to his death. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, her gaze steady. Yes, she said, it is all quite clear. The amber room had not simply displayed history, it had contained it, hidden within its structure, its reflections, its carefully altered panels, and Mr. Denham, standing at that final point, had seen it, not as something abstract, but as something immediate, something undeniable, something that could not remain hidden once recognized, and Miss Marple, who had followed the same path in her own quiet way, knew, with absolute certainty, that the answer to everything lay in that single moment, in what he had seen, and in who had been there, watching him see it, the truth within the reconstruction. Miss Marple did not sleep early that evening. It was not restlessness exactly, but a quiet insistence of thought, an understanding that had reached its final stage but required still a certain careful placing. Facts, she often reflected, were not enough on their own. They required context, they required meaning, and most of all, they required the courage to be acknowledged plainly. Yes, she murmured softly, seated by the dim light of her lamp, it is time to place it where it belongs. The following morning she didn't send messages or request formal meetings. Instead, she chose a simpler course, one that would allow matters to unfold without unnecessary complication. By late morning she had returned once again to the amber room. It was quieter now. The initial interest had faded, and the shadow of recent events had left its mark. Fewer visitors moved within the glowing chamber, and those who did spoke in subdued tones, as though aware that something beneath the surface had not yet fully settled. Miss Marple entered calmly, her gaze adjusting once more to the warm amber light. She did not pause to observe the room as a whole. That stage had passed. Instead, she walked directly to the central area, to the panel where the pattern had led, where Mr. Denham had stood, and where the truth had revealed itself. The man was there, as she had expected. He stood in quiet stillness, his attention once again fixed upon the panel, not as a visitor, but as someone waiting. Miss Marple approached him gently. "You knew I would return," she said. He did not turn immediately. "Yes," he replied. "I thought you might." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "It is all quite clear now," she said. The man's gaze remained on the panel. "Is it?" Miss Marple's expression was calm. "Yes," she said. "The pattern, the position, and what it reveals." There was a brief pause, then he turned to face her. "And what does it reveal, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple did not hesitate. "That the reconstruction is not entirely truthful," she said. "That certain elements within it do not belong, or at least are not what they are presented to be." The man regarded her steadily. "That is a serious claim." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "But not an unfounded one." She gestured lightly toward the panel. "From this position," she continued, "the reflections align. The variations in the panels, the differences in finish, create a composite image, not visible from any other angle, not intended to be." The man's expression did not change, but his silence confirmed her words. "And that image," Miss Marple said softly, "is not decorative." "No," he said, "it is not." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "It is a record," she said, "or rather, a fragment of one." The man did not deny it. "Yes," he said, "a fragment." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Something that should not have been included," she said. "Something taken from its original context and incorporated into this reconstruction." The man's voice was quiet. "You understand a great deal," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Enough," she said. There was a pause, then she continued. "Mr. Denham understood it as well." The man's gaze lowered briefly. "Yes. He followed the pattern," Miss Marple said. "He reached this position, and he saw what it revealed." "Yes. And in that moment," Miss Marple continued, "he recognized the truth, that the room was not simply a reconstruction, but a concealment, that something within it had been misrepresented." The man's voice was low. "Yes." Miss Marple did not move. "And he would not have ignored it," she said. "He would have spoken. He would have exposed it." The man closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Yes," he said, "he would have." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but there was no uncertainty in her voice now. "And that is why he could not be allowed to leave," she said. The words settled between them, quiet but unmistakable. The man did not respond immediately. Then he said, "You believe I killed him?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she said. There was no accusation in her tone, only certainty. The man did not look away. "It was not as simple as that," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said, "such things rarely are." There was a silence, longer this time and heavier. Then Miss Marple said very gently, "You understood the room long before he did." "Yes." "You knew what it contained." "Yes." "And you knew what would happen if someone else recognized it." The man's hands tightened slightly at his sides. "Yes." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You arranged the pattern," she said. "Or at least, you ensured that it would be followed." The man did not deny it. "Yes," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "You did not force him," she said. "You did not need to. You knew he would follow it himself." "Yes." "And when he reached this position," she allowed the sentence to remain incomplete. The man's voice was barely audible. "I was ready," he said. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. "Yes," she said. "You were ready." There was no need to describe the act itself. It had not been dramatic, not violent in any obvious sense, but it had been precise, deliberate, and timed to the exact moment when Mr. Denham understood what he had seen. Miss Marple's voice remained quiet. "You acted quickly," she said, "so that it would appear natural." The man nodded once. "Yes." "And it did," Miss Marple said. "At first." There was a pause, then she added, "But not entirely." The man regarded her with a faint, or almost weary expression. "No," he said, "not entirely." Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. "You understand what must happen now," she said. The man did not hesitate. "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You will tell them?" "Yes." There was no resistance, no attempt to deny or deflect, only acceptance. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "That is right," she said. The man looked once more at the panel, at the place where the reflections aligned and the truth revealed itself. "It should never have been included," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said. "But it was." "And now," he added, "it cannot be undone." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "No," she said, "it cannot." She turned then, her task complete, her understanding fully settled. As she moved toward the exit, the warm glow of the amber room remained unchanged, its beauty intact, its surface unbroken, but beneath that surface, the truth had been uncovered, and in that truth, the reason for Mr. Denham's death had been revealed. Miss Marple paused briefly at the doorway, her gaze lingering for just a moment. "Yes," she murmured softly, "the truth within the reconstruction. Not destroyed, not erased, but hidden, until someone had seen it, and once seen. It had demanded its consequence. What the amber kept, Miss Marple did not remain to witness the formal conclusion of the matter. It was never her habit to do so. The telling of truth, once it had been gently set in place, belonged to others. The authorities, the statements, the inevitable recording of facts in tidy lines that rarely conveyed the full weight of what had occurred. She preferred, or instead, to step away at the appropriate moment, allowing the quiet to return where it could. And yet, as she made her way back through the village, she was aware that the quiet would not be quite the same as before. "Yes," she murmured softly, "it never is." St. Mary Mead had already begun its gradual adjustment. Outwardly nothing had changed. The lanes remained as they were, the hedges trimmed, the small routines of daily life continuing with their familiar steadiness. But beneath that surface, there was something else. Not disturbance, exactly, not even unease, but a subtle shift, an awareness that something carefully arranged had been disturbed, not by accident, but by understanding. Miss Marple reached her home and seated herself by the window, her knitting resting once more in her lap. For a time she did not begin. Instead, she allowed her thoughts to settle, not in search of answers, for those had already been found, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had been revealed. "Yes," she said softly, "what it kept." The amber room had been designed to preserve beauty. That had been its purpose, its appeal, its outward identity. But in preserving beauty, it had also preserved something else, something less visible, but no less real. It had preserved a fragment of truth, not openly displayed, not intended for casual recognition, but present nonetheless, waiting for the right eye, the right mind, and the right moment to bring it into view. Mr. Denham had been that moment. Miss Marple's fingers began to move slowly, the familiar rhythm returning. "Yes," she murmured, "he saw it. Not as a curiosity, not as an accident, but as something that mattered, something that altered the meaning of everything around it, and in seeing it, he had done what he must have known he would do. He would not have remained silent. He would not have allowed such a truth to remain hidden within something so carefully presented as whole, and so, the consequence had followed. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her thoughts carried a quiet gravity. "Yes," she said, "it was inevitable. Not in the sense of fate, but in the sense of human nature. For truth, once recognized, has a way of demanding acknowledgement, and those who wish to conceal it, whether for protection, for pride, or for fear, are often driven to act in ways they might otherwise never consider. The man who had acted had not done so in haste, nor in uncontrolled anger. He had acted with precision, sussed with preparation, and with the clear understanding of what was at stake. Not merely a secret, but the unravelling of something carefully constructed over time. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly. He understood the cost. And he had chosen, in that moment, to bear it. There was no satisfaction in that understanding, only recognition. For Miss Marple had long since learned that such actions were rarely simple. They were not easily reduced to good or evil, right or wrong. They were instead the result of many small choices, accumulated, justified, and finally expressed in a single, irreversible act. She paused in her knitting, her gaze drifting once more toward the window. The light outside had softened into late afternoon, casting gentle shadows across the quiet street. Yes, she said. It remains. Not the event itself. That would pass into memory, into retelling, into the quiet reshaping that time always brings. But the understanding, the awareness that beneath even the most carefully arranged beauty, there may lie something unfinished, something unresolved, something that has not been fully accounted for. Florence entered quietly with the tea tray, her movements as careful as ever. "It's all settled, miss," she said gently. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she replied. Florence hesitated for a moment. "Such a strange thing," she added, "to think something like that could be hidden in plain sight." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not so strange," she said, "only unnoticed." Florence considered that, then nodded and withdrew. Miss Marple remained where she was, her thoughts now at rest. "Yes," she murmured softly, or what the amber kept. It had kept its light, its beauty, its appearance of completeness, but it had also kept something else, a fragment of truth that had not belonged there, and yet had remained quietly until someone had seen it for what it was. And once seen, it had changed everything. Miss Marple set her knitting aside as the final stitch fell into place, the pattern complete. She regarded it for a moment, then folded it neatly, her hands steady and sure. "Yes," she said, "that is enough." For there are some matters that do not require further explanation. They do not demand resolution in the ordinary sense. They simply take their place within the quiet understanding of those who have seen them clearly. And in St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple had always known, even the most carefully preserved things could hold within them truths that were never meant to be found. But once they were, they could not be hidden again. And that, she reflected, was the final lesson of the Amber Room. Not that beauty could deceive, but that truth, however deeply concealed, has a way of revealing itself, in its own time, in its own light, and to those who are willing to see it.